Welcome to The General and the Journalist, our podcast from the Times and the Sunday Times about conflict and how the old global order is breaking down. You're the journalist, Tom Newton-Dunn.
And Patrick, you're the General Sir Patrick Sanders, formerly head of the British Army. And this week, I'm in London Bridge at Times HQ. And Patrick, you're in Athens, of all places.
I am, Tom, speaking at a major intergovernmental conference. In fact, I found myself debating Iran with the former US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, yesterday, one of the architects of the US policy towards Iran in the first Trump administration. And it would have been useful to have him on the podcast just a few weeks ago when we were talking about Iran. Anyway, it's a great place to be. I'm not far away from the Temple of Poseidon. I'm looking out over the Bay of Athens. It genuinely is not the worst place to have a conference, Tom.
Well, thanks so much for all that wonderful colour of your luxury. So, a few weeks back, Lord Robertson, the former NATO Secretary General, was on this podcast, and he posed what we thought was a fascinating as well as quite a worrying scenario. And it was this.
I think proliferation of nuclear weapons is now going to be the norm after what has happened to Ukraine, which gave up its nuclear weapons in return for paper guarantees that were worthless at the end of the day. Other countries are now going to go down that route, however expensive and difficult it actually is.
And that conversation was obviously taking place just prior to the US attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. And it's a story which is far from over. Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, so that's the IAEA, said that Iran could start enriching uranium to produce a nuclear weapon in a matter of months. And while days earlier, Iran's parliament voted unanimously to stop cooperating with the nuclear watchdog.
So George's point got us thinking, didn't it? Because it goes far beyond Iran. The well-established nuclear powers like China and Russia are already building up and modernising their stockpiles again. The UK government is too. It just announced it's going to invest in a second form of delivering our nuclear deterrent. We have submarines, of course, but we're now buying air delivery. In other words, bombs dropped from F-35A jets. And also new countries, Patrick. So Poland, South Korea, both now actively talking about the need for their own nuclear arsenal. So in our new age of insecurity and the collapse of the rules-based order, is George Robertson right? Are we about to see a new rush from lots of countries to develop nuclear weapons? And whether we like it or not, are we entering what is now being called a third nuclear age?
Yeah, and the idea of us entering a third nuclear age is being kicked around in the defense think tank community. There's an excellent book by several authors, including Ben Zala, called The Global Third Nuclear Age. And that's been getting traction amongst defense chiefs. So just last December, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the chief of the defense staff in the UK, a former colleague and friend of mine, talked about the dawn of a third nuclear age at the Royal United Services Institute in London.
Well, let's unpack that phrase a bit more, shall we? And we probably need to go back and ask, therefore, what do we mean by the first two ages?
Well, I guess the first stage was really the dawn of nuclear powers and the very, very rapid and pretty much uncontrolled proliferation and buildup of nuclear forces. So that meant that within 20 years of the first atomic weapons test, driven by this intense Cold War competition, there became five nuclear powers and close to, get this figure, 40,000 nuclear warheads. And of course, because it was uncontrolled, because there was no framework for deterrence, that all came to a head with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Kennedy versus Khrushchev, of course, an extraordinary moment. But that also brought an end to the first age and the beginning of the second age, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I think it was looking over the precipice that really brought us into that new age. And that second age was a period of arms control designed to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, to bring some stability and predictability into that dynamic of deterrence between the United States and the USSR, and ultimately as well to begin the process of arms reduction. So it gets going in 1968 with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That's the NPT treaty. And today, only 5 countries are left outside this, and that's India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, and South Sudan. And then after that, you get the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the SALT. You get the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, that's START. You get the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, and so on. I mean, I could go on. But all through this period, And this is perhaps one of the most important points we'll be discussing today. The United States, in order to limit proliferation, offered something called extended deterrence to its allies. So the US pledged to protect NATO members with its nuclear arsenal. And that meant sometimes deploying nuclear weapons onto European soil, but it also offered that extended deterrence to its allies in the Indo-Pacific. So that was Australia, Japan, and South Korea, although they don't have nuclear weapons there. And that concept of extended deterrence has been incredibly important to maintaining stability and, crucially, to preventing proliferation.
So that second stage was all about deterrence, was it? And on both sides, really, rather than the use of nuclear weapons, people were too worried to, because the threat of mutually assured destruction from both sides loomed very large. And it worked, didn't it, really?
I mean, it did. We have had extraordinary stability for pretty much all of that time. And this sort of second nuclear age in particular has become the basis for, 50 years or so of in fact, longer, 80 years of nuclear deterrence theory. So what do we mean by deterrence? Well, deterrence is the use of threats and threats of force rather than force to prevent an enemy or an adversary from taking an undesired action. And so nuclear deterrence is designed to prevent nuclear and sometimes conventional attacks by threatening what would be catastrophic retaliation. So the first thing about deterrence is it has to be credible. You've got to believe that your opponent is going to retaliate. Secondly, you need a second strike capability. You've got to be able to absorb a nuclear attack and then retaliate effectively. If you don't have that second strike capability, then you're vulnerable and you're not credible. And that then leads to this concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction. That's a situation where both sides can inflict unacceptable damage even after absorbing a first strike. So the idea of mutual vulnerability becomes very important. And you get these concepts that roll through the decades of the Cold War, starting with massive retaliation doctrine from Eisenhower in 1954. So that was the idea that any action would trigger massive retaliation. I mean, it was cost effective because it meant you didn't have to maintain huge conventional armed forces, but it wasn't very credible. And then you get this crucial doctrine called flexible response. And that's brought about by President Kennedy and his defense secretary, Robert McNamara. And that's the idea that you respond proportionately and not always predictably. You might respond with conventional forces or with a tactical nuclear strike or strategic nuclear strikes. And all of that means that this idea of MAD, the mutually assured destruction, becomes the central logic.
The irony that it ended up being called MAD, the shortening of the acronym, I don't think was lost on anybody, of course. But Patrick, it's worth remembering as well now, and maybe the likes of anyone under the age of 40, 45 will have no memory of this. It was also quite a scary time throughout that Cold War, that sort of nuclear age, the second nuclear age, if you like. We're old enough to remember that. The lack of hair on our heads and our greying beards would testify to that. I remember primary school in the 1980s, we were regularly given drills on what to do if there was a nuclear strike. So I guess that the early 1980s was the absolute peak of all this, all the paranoia, the old men in Moscow. And we were told if the nuclear attack happened while we were at school, then we should hide under our desks. You were a little bit older than me, but probably in slightly longer trousers and probably been told the same thing, Patrick.
We were conscious of it all the time. I mean, to the extent that I joined CND as a campaign for nuclear disarmament as a schoolboy, I think most of my friends did. It felt like the smart thing to do. But I don't think any of us were aware at the time until afterwards just how close we came. So there's this NATO exercise, which is designed to test a period of increased tension and nuclear buildup, which NATO exercises. And that's in 1983. It's called Able Archer. And that is the closest that we came to nuclear war during the Cold War. The Soviet Union misreads the signals and thinks that what is in fact an exercise is actually the preparations for a nuclear strike. And then, of course, it was part of daily life. You know, we saw nuclear convoys driving around in Lincolnshire and Berkshire, moving from Green and Common. You know, it was a pattern of our lives growing up, and not a good one.
And it was Oleg Gordievsky, head of station in London for the KGB, spy for Britain for a long time, that tipped off Margaret Thatcher when he was still a spy in Moscow to say, the old men in Moscow really think you might be launching a strike on us, so they might launch one on you first. That man averted a nuclear war. I mean, a most extraordinary act, really. And the other thing I remember is, Patrick, that When the Wind Blows, that brilliant Raymond Briggs book, incredibly sad, really, came out in 1982 at exactly the same time as Able Archer, and this quite secret threat was all going on. So what sort of volume of nuclear weapons do we have today?
Well, it's a long list. I mean, Russia's got the most, so 4,300 warheads, we think. The US second with 3,700. China's got 600, but they're increasing by tens every, or 100 or so, I think, every year. And then you've got France and the UK, proportionally about the same number. So the French just short of 300, the UK round about 225, but it's reported, it's never confirmed. And then you've got the rest, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, with numbers ranging from 180, Pakistan and India are about the same, and then below 100 for Israel and North Korea. But it's not just a question of numbers, it's the types of nuclear weapons we have as well. Because if you're going to have a credible arsenal, one that can be survivable, it means you need a range of weapons from the very long range, very strategic ones, right the way down to short range, quite low yield, what we call tactical weapons.
Okay, we'll get into this in a bit more detail a little bit later on, but total numbers, they peaked around the early 80s, just that period we were just talking about, at 70,000 nuclear weapons all across the world, an extraordinary number. We're now down to, what, just below 10,000 in total? My very quick maths from your list there. It's still an awful lot of nuclear weapons flying around though, isn't it?
Yeah, more than enough to do global level damage. So that's the past. Let's move into the present, Tom. I mean, how do you think the geopolitical tensions have shifted to move us into this third nuclear age?
Well, I think there's a few reasons for it, isn't there? They're all sort of coming together at once. The first is the growing state-on-state conflict, tensions on the rise, and we see that in a lot of different places. The war in Ukraine is the most obvious, the largest conventional war in decades, and the first in Europe, obviously, in 80 years. Nuclear threats in that war have loomed large from the start. President Putin was very quick to start saber-rattling from the get-go when NATO started getting involved and backing up the Ukrainians. Of course, he never did anything about it. But in response, countries, especially nearby, really started to worry. Poland in particular. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk told its parliament that it was time to react to their threat from Russia, that they should look at having their own nuclear capabilities potentially. This is a race for security, not for war, is the way Donald Tusk put it. Also, the Ukrainians' response. President Zelensky said last year that either we get protection in some sort of alliance like NATO, or we need to get our own nuclear weapons to stop the Russians from invading against once we've got them out this time. And that's an important point, isn't it, Patrick? Because Ukraine, just to go back a couple more years, remain absolutely furious about something called the Budapest Memorandum, something that was agreed in 1994 that Ukraine would get security guarantees, defense from the West, if you like, in exchange for surrendering their nuclear arsenal, as in all nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had in Ukraine at the time when the Soviet Union broke up. They had the third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, did Ukraine. And of course, that was a huge betrayal when the West never did come to Ukraine's aid in 2014 when the war first started, and felt bitterly today, Patrick, in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think rightly so. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum was actually an undertaking not to attack Ukraine. It wasn't a mutual defense obligation, rather like NATO and Article 5 is. There's no enforcement. I mean, the only thing that the memorandum said was there was an agreement to consult with each other and to seek immediate assistance in the UN Security Council. And of course, Russia has a veto power. So the lesson I think that Ukraine at least will take away from this is that if you don't have direct or extended nuclear deterrence, then you are vulnerable to attack by conventional means or indeed by nuclear means.
Okay, another reason, a second reason, if you like, for why we're into this third age now, this great age of fear and insecurity, is uncertainty about the US and how much it really will come to its allies' help in the future. And it's not just Donald Trump, actually. The US has been really relitigating its place in the world, where it wants to be, where it wants to put its troops for going back to Obama's time, really, the shift to the Pacific. And that does make people ask questions. What are they going to leave in Europe? Are they going to leave nuclear weapons in Europe? And will they ever feel they must retaliate with nuclear weapons if a NATO ally in Europe is attacked?
I mean, if there's a situation that emerges where your enemies, your adversaries are going to acquire a nuclear capability or have one, and you no longer have confidence in the United States guarantee of extended deterrence, then that is precisely the sort of conditions that can trigger a race towards nuclear proliferation.
A third reason of why we are where we are is the abandonment, if you like, of some of those Cold War treaties. The US, in particular, under Donald Trump's first presidency, withdrew from a couple. Effectively, he wanted to give the US greater room for maneuver, especially to saber rattle and frighten Russia and China. And the fourth and final reason is China. China is growing massively. Its military is undergoing an extraordinary revolution, and their nuclear arsenal is currently the fastest growing in the world. They're adding, we believe, 100 new warheads every single year since 2023. They're on 600 now. They'll be at 1,000 come the end of the decade. But, I mean, Patrick, you could look at all this as just a repeat of a Cold War chapter, another return to nuclear shadow dancing, if you like. But you think this third age is actually a lot more dangerous than what potentially has come before?
Because it's got so many features of the first nuclear age. I mean, the first and perhaps the most alarming reason is this collapse of arms control. I mean, you just talked about it, but just reflect, for the first time in our lifetime, we will have no arms control regime next year between the United States and Russia unless we can renegotiate START 2. Then I guess secondly, in the Cold War, we developed these mechanisms, these communication channels, these habits of de-escalation and consultation. And those have dried up, and they still exist to an extent, but they're not as good as they were. I think thirdly, we had this generation of experts, of statesmen, of diplomats, of politicians, of soldiers, and so on, who were deeply vested in deterrence theory. They had this extraordinary expertise, and we no longer have those people. We don't have that muscle memory. Then you get to the introduction of the impact of new technology. So technologies like artificial intelligence, non-nuclear strategic weapons. It's the idea that you can combine AI, offensive cyber, hypersonic missiles, and change the calculus of nuclear actors. That's a new thing that we haven't had before. And then you talked about it. We've got the risks of proliferation, and we have these new alliances. And if not an alliance, this alignment between three pretty hostile nuclear powers, so China, Russia, and North Korea, and Iran as a nuclear latent power. And that introduces additional complexity to the whole calculus and the whole balance, which kept us safe. It was the stability behind deterrence that made the Cold War, made us survive and get through the Cold War without a nuclear exchange.
And the real worry is that all of that, which is a fairly worrying world, creates a domino effect, with various different countries triggering each other, not wanting to be the one that is bullied because they're the ones left without the nuclear weapons. So that means countries who have talked about having nuclear ambitions before, but never went on to develop them, might now feel the need to go ahead. So Saudi Arabia, for example, to protect themselves from others in the region, Iran, if Iran ever gets that nuclear capacity, or maybe because they see themselves as regional superpowers, and if so-and-so's got one, they need one too. So the likes of Turkey or the BRIC countries in the Southern Hemisphere. So Patrick, where are we right now? How are these sort of different countries reacting to the threat of this third nuclear age?
So Ben Zala, the author of The Third Global Nuclear Age, puts countries in one of four buckets. So you've got, first of all, this group, which he describes as the activists and the protesters. And they are very firmly advocating disarmament. That's countries like Austria, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Indonesia. Then you've got the hedges and balances. And this is quite an interesting grouping because these countries represent sort of continuity, but also change. They've got quite wide-ranging military strategies. And this brings together Iran, Germany, India, China, and the UK. So not an easy mix, but they're all thinking in similar terms. Then you've got a group who are technological transformers, but also conventional warfighters. So rather than pursuing nuclear capabilities, they try to provide deterrence through conventional capabilities and by getting a technological edge in the area, in particular, of non-nuclear strategic weapons that I was talking about previously. Because as I was saying, that allows you to provide the same degree of deterrence, almost, without nuclear capabilities. And that brings together countries like Japan, Australia, Israel, Taiwan, and South Korea. And you'll notice that some of these countries are already nuclear. So it's not a sort of homogeneous. These you can be in more than one bracket, and then you end up with the traditionalists. So these are countries that are committed to nuclear weapons for homeland and in some cases for extended deterrence. They have pretty orthodox nuclear strategies. So that's the United States, France, Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea.
And as the geopolitics moves on, what's going to be really interesting, isn't it, is which countries shift from those buckets to another. So, for example, one country might have been traditionally a great protester, but now might thinking secretly, well, actually, I need to be a hedger or a traditionalist.
And you could shift, Tom. So you could find the UK, which at the moment is firmly committed to maintaining its nuclear capabilities, seeing that as technology emerges, we may be able to achieve deterrence through these non-nuclear strategic weapons. So you might see fundamental shifts in nuclear policy. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it sort of reinforces your point.
And I think we're going to have to come back and do a whole fresh episode on your extraordinary scenario of an AI mixed with cyber, mixed with hypersonic missile attack, because my mind boggles on that. But that's a separate 40 minutes sometime in the future. So look, if that's where we are now, should we look at what rearmament actually looks like? What do we actually mean by nuclear weapons? Because there's an awful lot of different types. The first delineation is strategic nuclear weapons and tactical. And you're going to be better placed, Patrick, with 40 years in the military, of explaining the difference between those two than me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems slightly nonsensical to describe any nuclear weapon as not being strategic, because the moment you detonate one, you're having a strategic effect. It doesn't matter what the size is. But Russian nuclear doctrine views nuclear weapons as rather like the rungs on a ladder of escalation. So you could, in Russian doctrine, have a nuclear exchange without it leading to all-out nuclear war. So in simple terms, strategic nuclear weapons tend to be long range, so they're intercontinental, have a very high yield, and they're designed for use against strategic targets. So these are either your opponent's nuclear capabilities, so they're counter force, or you go after political targets, so centers of governments, capital cities, critical infrastructure, and so on. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you've got tactical nuclear weapons. So these are much lower yield, so usually sub 10 kiloton. They are shorter range, and they are designed to achieve military advantage on the battlefield. So it's not having a strategic effect, it's having a tactical or an operational effect.
Okay, and then we have the different delivery methods, don't we? And they can range from anything from the bottom of the chain, if you like, the most primitive, a dirty nuclear bomb in a suitcase, just very radioactive elements that you could explode, and that would cause a terrible mess. Then the next stage, gravity nuclear bombs, what you could think is the old-fashioned things, stuck to planes and literally drop from the sky, quite high, of course, because the planes don't want to get caught by the blast. Then missiles, probably the most advanced form of delivery, fired from ships and submarines at sea, like the Royal Navy's, or missile silos on land. And even back in the day in the Cold War, Patrick, possibly when you were serving as well, I don't know if you ever loaded one of these into an artillery piece, there were even nuclear-tipped artillery shells actually fired from guns on the battlefield.
Yeah, and so each of the services had a nuclear capability. For the Royal Navy, it was the submarines. For the Royal Air Force, it was the bombs from the jets. And the Army had nuclear artillery, and it was nuclear-tipped shells or nuclear-tipped missiles, but all quite short range and all low yield. And it's crazy to think that, we had bunkers with nuclear weapons in them.
Have you ever been up front and close to nuclear weapons yourself during your service?
I did, Tom. I mean, several times, actually. So when I was a young platoon commander in the Cold War, we used to get told to go off and do what they call nuclear site guards. And you would literally guard one of these bunkers where nuclear weapons were stored. And you were at a very, very high level of readiness, because the threat from Russian special forces and Spetsnaz during the Cold War was felt to be very high. And then at the other end, I have been on what they call one of these day zero patrols. So that's the final day of the patrol on one of our continuous at sea deterrent Vanguard submarine.
I've been on one of those too. The Vanguard class, we've got 4 of those submarines at the moment. One of them always at sea, somewhere lurking underneath the North Atlantic, undetectable, with nuclear weapons on board, Trident missiles to fire back at anyone who attacks us. I have to say my experience was noteworthy, really. I think I went with the Defence Secretary years back when I was a defence correspondent. He was inspecting this great boat, etc. And all us defence hacks were taken on board. We sailed from Devonport, the big Royal Navy dockyard in Plymouth, And it was a really choppy day. The seas were really, really choppy. And a submarine, when it's cruising along the surface, before it dives, you are thrown around like a sock in a washing machine. And the worst thing is, if anyone's ever been car sick, is that you've got no perspective. There are no windows, obviously, to look out of. So I found myself feeling really quite sick quite quickly, to the point we were giving a tour of the main control room. I'm standing over the guy who's actually steering the submarine control panel, and I think I am now going to be sick. I now have to run somewhere very quickly so I don't do something terrible all over the instruments. And just at that moment, wonderfully, the submarine dived. We went underwater, and it was the most blissfully calm experience. You weren't thrown around at all. I cannot tell you how happy I was that I was saved. My blushes from an appalling embarrassment. So, Patrick, do you know what the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated was?
Hey, Tom, but I know someone who does.
Well, you're talking to the right man, and I did my research last night on this. It was actually called the Tsar Bomber. It's also the largest nuclear weapon ever built as well. And it was detonated on October the 30th, 1961 by the Russians. It had a 50 megaton yield, so now there's 50 million tons of TNT equivalent. It was 26 feet long and almost 7 feet in diameter. And it was dropped on Severny Island, which is Russian territory inside the Arctic Circle. And actually, the crew only just survived at the point of detonation, because when it did detonate, it vaporized everything within 35 miles and caused severe damage up to 150-mile radius. 1,500 times more powerful, in fact, than both bombs dropped on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So a ridiculously large bomb, appalling in its devastation. Bombs that big have never been built since. And actually the positive from that is there was such world outrage about this, because it was a pretty hard thing to disguise, that it led to the first, if you like, codification, perhaps the move from nuclear age 1 to nuclear age 2 with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of August the 5th, 1963. So that's what nuclear bombs do. That's their vast and appallingly awful range of destruction. Should we move on to how easy it is to actually acquire them then, Patrick? So how do you build a nuclear bomb, and how easy is it to do from scratch?
Well, getting some uranium is relatively simple, but getting it to become enriched uranium, that's much trickier. So there are 5 stages. I mean, step 1, you choose your fuel, and that's either going to be plutonium or it's going to be uranium. And uranium, if you're going with the uranium, you need high-speed centrifuges to enrich uranium to weapons-grade material. And now we've seen that, a lot of talk about that and what's been going on in Iran. So having done that, you then get some uranium. Now, you can mine that commercially. It comes from a powder known as yellow cake. Do you remember all the discussions around yellow cake around the Iraq War? But the world's biggest producer is in Kazakhstan. Once you've got your uranium, you have to process it. You can separate uranium-235 isotopes from 238, which is most uranium, by spinning them in a centrifuge. And 238 has more neutrons and therefore slightly more mass. And then once you've got all of that, you have to turn it into a weapon and you have to test it. So to turn it into a weapon, you've got to get it onto a missile. So you've got to take the uranium and form it into metal. You create it into 2 half spheres, which an explosion will force together. Or you can go with a simple gun weapon, which can be formed into discs. But while it's simpler, that needs much, much more uranium. And then you find the weapon system, the delivery system, and then you test it. And you may have to test your weapon secretly, because the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna will pick up with a global network of seismometers and radionuclide detectors any nuclear explosions that have happened.
Well, I'm very, very impressed by that knowledge, Patrick. And I think actually a lot of us are probably a bit more familiar with the process of building a nuclear weapon because of Iran and the news in the last couple of weeks. What do we do about it all now? We've explained what they are, how we've got where we are to, and the current threats and the great worries. But how do we tackle this? What do we do about this new Russian nuclear weapons, the third nuclear age? How do we control it? And can it even be controlled is a huge question, really. Should we start with the rules? The NPT then, the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is still the main guide point. And just explain, perhaps, if you could, what exactly that treaty does.
Well, in simple terms, it does what it says on the tin, Tom.
But the big debate now is, does it really? Does anyone still pay it any attention? And what are its teeth? Does it really still matter in this new age of war and insecurity?
So it is a bit of a miracle, Tom, that the NPT continues to exist. I mean, historians 50 years ago probably wouldn't have put a bet on that. And it basically does two things. It's designed to ensure that states that don't have nuclear weapons don't acquire them. And there's a safeguard system through the IAEA. The nuclear states, the five signatories nuclear states that are part of the NPT, agree voluntary safeguard agreements so they can strengthen the system. But it also has this clause which obliges all states which have signed to pursue disarmament negotiations in good faith. And that's the bit that hasn't really delivered. We're probably further away from disarmament rather than closer to it.
And it also provided for the setting up of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, as its oversight arm, really. We can't even call it an enforcement arm because that's the problem with it, isn't it, really? The IAEA doesn't actually have any enforcement powers. It can go in and look at stuff and then make recommendations to the UN Security Council. But at the end of the day, it's the UN Security Council that is in charge of enforcing stuff. And when the Security Council is, to all greater extents, a meaningless body these days because it's split down the middle and Russia will veto one thing and America or Britain or France might veto another, you're effectively left with not very much at all.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the NPT has worked. And it has implied sanctions and punishments. So North Korea, when they withdrew from the treaty in 2003, they faced, very, very extensive international sanctions and political isolation that remains to this day. And Iran, of course, has also faced sanctions until the JCPOA, we were talking about that 2 weeks ago, in 2015 for their covert nuclear activities. So yes, it doesn't have the sort of teeth, but it is an international treaty. But countries still continue to stick to it.
Yeah, apart from those who haven't, like North Korea, like Iran and others. But question marks, I guess, we could probably agree on over its value going forward and whether people are still going to listen to it. So if those are the rules, we've talked at length about extended deterrence, that really important concept throughout the Cold War. If the US is no longer going to provide it, we can't rely on the US anymore to provide it, could the French and the British step up? We're the two nuclear powers in Europe. Could we replace the US and do that extended deterrence role across Europe?
But I think the first thing to say is that we should take the French and the British nuclear deterrent very seriously, and indeed the Russians do. And they're very sophisticated and they are very resilient. They're hard to get at, and they can cause catastrophic damage to strategic targets in Russia. But that we have small numbers of them. And of course, we don't have anything like the numbers that the Russians do, nor do we have the range that the Russians and the Americans do. So although over time it may be possible to create a form of extended deterrence provided by the UK, who already have declared their nuclear deterrent to NATO, or to the French, for whom it is sovereign, but they say that by default it provides protection to Europe because France, of course, is on the continent itself. But even in those circumstances, it would take an enormous amount of time. And frankly, the size, the depth, the resilience, the scale, the sophistication of the US nuclear deterrent is irreplaceable. And I find it impossible to conceive that we would ever be able to go to that extent. So this is why maintaining extended deterrence from the US is so important, and indeed is in the United States' interest, because there's no country that is more threatened by nuclear proliferation than the United States.
It's interesting, isn't it? Though our nuclear deterrent, Britain's nuclear arsenal is so important to us, it's something we so rarely talk about or even wanted to consider, let alone extending the deterrence to the rest of Europe. Out of interest, Patrick, as a Chief of the General Staff, as a very senior military officer for some time, you'd have planned a lot of conflicts, a lot of potential scenarios, real and actual. Did nuclear planning, as in using nuclear weapons, ever form part of any of the plans that you were involved in?
So we always conducted training at a very tactical level for what happened if nuclear weapons went off, and we built in nuclear hardening against the electromagnetic pulse that nuclear weapons create into a lot of our equipment. But one of the strange oddities of UK nuclear culture is that we're quite reserved, we're quite reluctant about it. A friend and colleague of mine, Air Marshal Ed Stringer, when we were both serving, used to discuss this when we were running Strategic Command. In fact, he's written an excellent article on it for Policy Exchange. And what we were discussing was that it was strange contrast between the Russians, the Americans, the French. Their officers are educated to think in terms of how you do nuclear signaling, how you de-escalate, how you have a doctrine for battlefield nuclear weapons, how you exercise and prepare for it. But we don't really do that in the UK because we've only got strategic nuclear weapons. And so our expertise, our planning, our thinking isn't mainstream, and it's limited to a very small cadre, a sort of group of high priests. And I've always felt, and this was Ed's point in his article, this is a weakness that we have to correct.
A weakness, but perhaps reassuring to the general British public as well that all the generals aren't busy plotting nuclear attacks from some simplistic perspective. But I completely take your point. I think we should also ask another question when we're debating this whole issue of what on earth do we do about this potential new rush to nuclear. And that's under the NPT, the rules, which still kind of exist. The original nuclear powers, the five, were allowed to keep their arsenals. They had to get rid of a few, but they were allowed to keep hold of them. And so as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century, where we now are, whether a world of nuclear haves and have-nots are really justifiable, I think is a fair point, isn't it? Because I think that's how a lot of the world might see this. You can keep yours, but we can't get ours or have to get rid of the ones we're trying to build. That's certainly how the Southern Hemisphere might see it. How do we morally defend that stance?
It's not just the Western powers or the victors of World War II that have nuclear weapons. Of the 9 nuclear powers, only 4 of those are from what you might describe as the West. The rest are, these kind of hostile Axis powers, so China, Russia, and North Korea, or they are global South powers, so India, Pakistan, and South Africa formerly. No one forced anyone to sign the NPT. I mean, it's in everyone's interest to avoid proliferation.
So let's call it, Patrick. Let's come to the conclusion and try and answer George Robertson's question. Is nuclear proliferation, a new rush to nuclear weapons now going to happen? Is that going to be the norm?
Okay. Well, what do you think, Tom?
Well, look, we just talked it all through, and on the current trajectory, it's very hard to see how it won't be. And I think, yes, we are very much heading for a new rush to nuclear, not least because there's no apparent attempt at all, or really interest from those who could make it happen, for the world to come together and agree a fresh set of rules. It's basically the US. The US would have to lead that, or Europe, if you like. And Donald Trump is doing the opposite by ripping up treaties. And certainly Europe is in no position to lead at the moment with our paucity of defense spending. So I fear, yes. And I'd also therefore predict another thing, more wars to try and stop proliferation in different states, just as we've seen the one with the US and Israel against Iran. The big countries, especially the holders at the moment, will want to stop this, and they will end up almost certainly having to do it by force in some areas. How about you? What's your conclusion, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm fairly gloomy about this. I think it's very likely that we will see over decades to come the breakdown in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and increasing proliferation of nuclear weapons. But I hold out some hope, and I'm going to play a more optimistic note here than you, because I think the fact that the NPT has survived, the fact that extended deterrence from the United States has provided a break, an umbrella, a reassurance that means that people don't feel they need to go to nuclear states. The thing I'd point to as being perhaps the biggest spoiler in all of this is the emergence of non-nuclear strategic weapons, because you may not need to go down a nuclear route if you can invest in technologies that allow you to achieve many of the same effects against nuclear armed states.
Okay. Well, those are our conclusions. Just fascinating how quickly the world is changing. It just seems to be changing at an ever faster rate, week by week now, really, doesn't it? Well, look, before we go, let's just check in quickly again on last week's NATO summit. I was at The Hague, you were at London Bridge, where I now am, and it was obviously a pivotal summit. And this podcast has been given some really interesting new polling which we can reveal. It's a poll of 2,000 British adults done by the group More in Common on what we, Brits, British voters, now think of NATO itself. And it was carried out in the run-up to that big NATO summit. And it suggests some really interesting things, Patrick. Support for NATO has dropped is the main headline. Only 56% of adults now think NATO is an important military alliance. That's down from 65% last year. That's quite a drop. And here's the most worrying statistic. Only a third, 36% of young Britons, aged between 18 to 24, now think NATO is an important military alliance. We should add in that 40% say they have no idea whatsoever, and about 25% say either it never has been or it isn't now. Interesting, if you look down the polling demographics, the older you are, the more important you see NATO as being, and that's probably because people remember the Cold War the older they are. What do you make of those numbers, Patrick, especially that quite big drop in support for NATO?
Well, I'm inclined to say that I think any time or any age you asked 18 to 24s about NATO, you probably wouldn't get much more of a different answer. In fact, those 65 to 74-year-olds you quoted, who's 73% of whom are in support of NATO, when they were 18 to 24, they probably said something similar to the current crop. But I'm not going to duck your question. I think the fundamental behind this is really worrying because it portrays two things to me. It portrays a lack of understanding of the risks and the threat and the danger that we face. But more importantly, a lack of understanding that our security and our safety against those threats is in NATO. So this is rather like ripping up, to use George Robertson's words, the family's insurance policy because you don't like the company or you don't like the premium you're paying, and it will catch up with you.
Okay. There we must end it. Your questions and thoughts have been absolutely fascinating. Please keep on sending them in. We're really keen to hear from you. We read every email. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, the email address again, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's one more time, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. Until next week, therefore, Patrick, after another fascinating discussion, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.